Well, Crystal and Justin, thank you so much for joining me. Justin, I'll start with you. What conversations, if any, did you have about race growing up, and how did that change?
We really didn't have conversations about race. Where I grew up outside of Pittsburgh was very vanilla, so to speak. Mostly folks who were Caucasian, hardly any people of color. And so it just wasn't a conversation we really had. Now, in my family, there certainly was both prejudiced and outright racist tendencies, but it wasn't really talked about very, very much. So I grew up without really understanding privilege, without understanding whiteness and how that, puts you on third base oftentimes. And so it wasn't until much later that started to be uncovered. And I certainly would say that in the way that I grew up pretty racist.
Wow. Crystal, what about you? Growing up, what was your experience in conversations about race?
Well, one of the things I write about in my book is the fact that I didn't grow up talking about, hearing about race and racism very much. My mother, we're from the South, we're from Tennessee. So I first grew up there and then we moved to the East Coast. And I think my mom, having herself lived through desegregation in Tennessee, she really wanted to protect me from the harsh realities of racism. So there's a lot that she didn't share about her own experiences until I got much older. So, growing up, I lived through things like the Rodney King beatings, right? I mean, being a child of the 80s, I was living through the expansion of mass incarceration, but I didn't realize that. There was this whole imagery of Black inclusion in our popular culture. Growing up watching Oprah and Beyonce and Janet Jackson, and you could have this superficial understanding of race relations and think, oh, wow, Black people have made it in a certain way, if you don't understand the structural realities of racism. And so it was really when I got to college and I started to take sociology classes, and actually it was a white teacher, and this is something that I write about in How to Be Less Stupid About Race. It was a white sociologist who shared a book and actually many books with me in our class that semester that helped me understand structural inequalities for the first time in a really deep way. And this includes racism, but also class inequalities and other forms of oppression. And then importantly, he also taught us in that class that we can work collectively to change our society for the better. And so that really inspired what has become a lifelong commitment to anti-racism for me.
Justin, full disclosure, I know you personally through the church, and so I know that you didn't just have this overnight revelation about racism, but it does seem like a lot of white people are choosing to get off the sidelines now and ramp up their participation in this national conversation. Why do you think that is? Why now?
I think there's a number of factors kind of that contribute to it. First and foremost, people are at home. Right? That we're in the middle of a pandemic, and all of this, when evil shows itself, that's when things and consciousness begin to change. And when George Floyd was choked to death in front of everybody, and we watched this go down, and, and the endless other ones, for whatever reason, didn't get us to that tipping point. But I think that was the moment, after a series of moments and bad stuff happening, that it woke us all up in a different way. And, I told you before, when we were talking before, just about my own kind of conversion, which certainly is ongoing. And I'm not there by any stretch of the imagination, but I started to realize about privilege when I was about 25 and became a social worker. And then I took some African-American women's studies in graduate school, and then being rooted in the Bible, and everybody having the divine image, and the vows we say at baptism to resist evil in all of its forms. I think that has sparked a desire in people of faith, hopefully, and just anyone, to see that this can't go on. this must stop. And I've got to get out of the sidelines and start getting aware, educated, and engaged. Those are the three things that I think it's all about for me.
Aware, educated, and engaged. That's great. Crystal, you literally wrote the book, How to Be Less Stupid About Race. So what are some stupid things that well-intentioned people do when talking about race?
I don't see color. Saying things like I don't see color, denying that we have all been socialized to understand each other in terms of race and racial categories. There's a lot of denial that happens, particularly among white Americans, when they're first introduced to these issues. I think white saviorism is also something that we deal with, even in anti-racism. That is the idea that white people know how to solve racism without really looking to the leadership and knowledge of Black people and people of color. I think sometimes well-intentioned people think that they can understand issues of race without studying history, and you can't. And it's not even enough just to study racial history. You actually have to be intentional about studying history from the perspectives of Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. Because what we get in school, and this is why I wrote my book, is a really sanitized version of our history. Some people would say a whitewashed version of history. And in order to get real, we have to really center the perspectives of Black people and people of color.
Justin, a lot of white people say, I'm not racist, I'm a good person, I have friends or family members who are this race or that race. Why is that not enough?
I think just to start out, it's just insensitive to even say that, right? First, to get back to what you said earlier, Crystal, like to say, oh, I don't see race, or I haven't done this and I'm a good person and I've got Black friends. That's the great statement, right? That is not only insensitive, but it doesn't acknowledge what is, right? It doesn't acknowledge what is. And I think that, like I said, to become aware of the things that Crystal talked about history. And I described this moment that happened to me when I was a home visitor. And really what came over me was structural poverty, institutional racism. Those weren't the words going through my head, but that was the revelation that came to me at that time. I popped out and had education and advantages and all these things that some folks don't. And to be a part of the change, you can't just say, that's not my problem, because we participate in the machinery of the problem. And so becoming aware and getting educated is the first thing, and then engage, which can be really hard because it feels like analysis paralysis. I walked in some of the protests over these weeks, and I chose just to be quiet and just to walk in solidarity and not try to, just to be present, just to be a white presence. And that to me felt like my role now. And we're doing some other stuff through the church and through some organizations, but that's what I'm called to do now.
And can I just say, I love that. What I love about what you've said, Justin, is that sometimes white people need to understand that your role is not to speak in or your role is sometimes to witness and to be present. And to really stand in solidarity with Black people and people of color. Of course, sometimes your role is to speak. I understand you're a pastor, so you need to speak, right? So, right, and everyone has a sphere of influence. And so one of the questions I try to get people to think about critically is, how can I listen to Black people and people of color, but also white folks within your sphere of influence? How can you, right, in white spaces, and I think we're going to talk more about segregation, right? How can you be an accomplice for anti-racist change in those white spaces?
Right. That's critically important. You're absolutely right. And there's no doubt there's the target for for much of this change has to be people who are either shut down, ignorant, or against this kind of transformation that we're being called to.
Justin, you talked about the importance of engagement. What are some local ways that our Tampa Bay audience can get more involved with this cause?
Well, first of all, just locally in our own congregation, we're having people engage in groups of learning groups, we're calling them, and we're reading a couple of books. So we've got 3 groups going on, 2 on white fragility, 1 on how to be an anti-racist. Crystal, now that I know about your book, maybe we'll bring that into the mix as well. Secondly, and this has been really important for our congregation, who, P.S., is primarily a white congregation, is to engage in something called the Hillsborough Organization for Progress and Equality, HOPE. But the parent organization, DART, is all across the nation. And so I think that's a really important way. Hillsborough Organization for Progress and Equality, we're looking at criminal justice and mass incarceration. We're studying racial inequalities. And, you know, justice is different than charity. Justice is looking at the systems upon which these things flourish, and then how do we go about it. And so I think that's a way to start. Again, get educated, get aware, and there's lots of other organizations around these issues that people could engage.
Okay, Crystal, you wrote the book, How to Be Less Stupid About Race. What's one thing we can do tomorrow? What's the homework for America?
Well, the first thing I would say is that the most important thing is to understand that your homework doesn't end. This homework is for the rest of your life. And that might sound daunting, but it should also inspire you, because the anti-racist mobilizations we see today, and that some of us are part of today, they've been going on for generations. We are part of a long process, a long political struggle to improve our society and to really transform it in fundamental ways. And so we have to have a long-term vision and understand that, you know, things like learning communities, that's going to have to be lifelong. Another thing you can do, you know, as you create learning communities and join anti-racist groups, Showing Up for Racial Justice, for example, is a group that organizes white anti-racists. But another thing you can do is to center the perspectives of Black women and women of color, because they're often left out of these conversations. They're often marginalized, and we have to learn from the work of people like Kimberly Crenshaw, the scholar who coined the term intersectionality, because we have to understand that racism is bound up with sexism and class inequalities and other forms of oppression. And it's really knowledge from Black women and women of color that has made that clear. And so when we exclude those voices or we marginalize them, we miss a huge part of our collective homework.
I'm gonna need more pencils for all this homework. Well, author Crystal Fleming and Reverend Justin LaRosa, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us.
Thanks for having us.
Really grateful to be here. Thank you.